They called me nothing in that courtroom, a nameless woman with fabricated dreams, and the gallery laughed as if my humiliation were entertainment staged for their amusement. But I have learned that the deepest truths often wear the disguise of silence, waiting for the precise moment when revelation becomes not just possible, but inevitable. I am old now. My hands, which once trembled before judges and aristocrats, now rest quiet on the armchair beside my window, and the London fog that creeps across the garden carries with it the scent of memories I have spent a lifetime learning to hold gently. I was not always Eleanor Blackwood. For most of my life, I was simply Eleanor Ashford, a name I wore like borrowed clothes, never quite understanding why it never fit. The story I'm about to tell you spans the distance between the woman I was and the woman I became, and at its center stands a man whose gray eyes taught me that trust, once shattered, can be rebuilt from fragments sharper and more beautiful than the original glass. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me begin where all my beginnings truly started. In the cold marble halls of the Court of Chancery, in the autumn of 1889, when I stood accused of being no one at all. I remember the way the light fell through the high windows that morning, pale and indifferent, as if even the sun had decided to withhold its judgment until the proceedings concluded. I wore my only remaining good dress, a deep blue wool that had seen better days, and I had pinned my hair with hands that would not stop shaking, no matter how sternly I commanded them. The fabric smelled faintly of lavender from the sachets I kept in my small wardrobe, a scent that reminded me of the better times in my marriage, before Gregory's coldness had become so absolute that even the pretense of affection had vanished. My husband, Lord Gregory Pemberton, sat across the courtroom with his solicitors arrayed around him like generals preparing for a battle they had already won. He did not look at me. In 3 years of marriage, I had grown accustomed to his averted gaze. But that morning it struck me with fresh force, the realization that I had never been real to him, merely a piece in a game whose rules I had never understood. His dark hair was perfectly pomaded, his cravat tied with mathematical precision, his face arranged in an expression of long-suffering dignity that I knew was as rehearsed as any theatrical performance. His barrister, a man named Whitmore with a voice like cold water over stones, rose to address the court. He spoke of my origins with the kind of theatrical disgust that plays well to galleries filled with people who have never known want. I was, he declared, an orphan of uncertain parentage, raised in charitable institutions, employed as a governess before my marriage. I had, according to his account, deliberately concealed my lowly station in order to ensnare a nobleman into matrimony. I was a fraud, a schemer, a woman of no family, no fortune, and no right to the name I had carried for 3 years. The gallery murmured and rustled like wind through autumn leaves. I heard someone laugh, a bright, brittle sound that seemed to echo off the marble columns and multiply in the vaulted ceiling above us. A woman in an elaborate hat whispered something to her companion, and both turned to look at me with the avid curiosity that society reserves for public spectacles. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to become as invisible as they already believed me to be. But I remained standing, my spine straight, my chin lifted, because my mother, whoever she truly was, had taught me that dignity is the one thing that cannot be taken unless you surrender it yourself. I had met Gregory at a house party in Kent 4 years before our wedding. I was governess to the Ashworth children, 3 lively youngsters whose education had been entrusted to my care after their previous governess had departed under circumstances no one would explain to me. The Ashworth estate sprawled across rolling hills that turned golden in the autumn light, and the house itself was a sprawling Tudor manor that seemed to have grown organically over centuries, adding wings and towers as each generation saw fit. Gregory was a guest of Lord Ashworth, there for the hunting and, as I later learned, to scout for a bride whose lack of connections would make her easy to control. I first saw him in the garden, standing among the roses with a cigarette in his hand, watching me as I led the children through their afternoon constitutional. His gaze had a weight to it that I felt even before I turned to meet his eyes. He was handsome in the way that aristocratic men often are, with features that spoke of generations of careful breeding and a bearing that suggested he had never in his life doubted his own importance. I was not beautiful in the way that debutantes are beautiful. My features were too strong, my jaw too defined, my coloring too dark, my manner too direct. I had been told often enough that I would do better to cultivate softness, to lower my eyes and modulate my voice and perform the gentle helplessness that men apparently found attractive. But I had never mastered the art of pretense, and by the time I met Gregory, I had stopped trying. I was what I was, a working woman of education and determination, dependent on my employment, but not ashamed of it. Gregory had looked at me across that garden and seen something he wanted, and in my loneliness and inexperience, I had mistaken his attention for admiration and his persistence for love. He sought me out during the house party, finding excuses to speak with me, asking questions about my work and my interests with what seemed like genuine curiosity. He walked with me in the gardens after the children had gone to bed, talking of poetry and philosophy, subjects I had assumed were beyond the concern of men who spent their days hunting and gambling. Our courtship was brief and our wedding quiet. His family disapproved, of course. Lady Pemberton, his mother, had made her contempt clear from the first moment I entered her home as Gregory's wife. She looked at me as one might look at an insect that had somehow found its way into the soup, with distaste barely concealed beneath a veneer of icy politeness. She asked pointed questions about my family, my education, my prospects, and when my answers failed to satisfy her, she simply stopped asking, choosing instead to pretend I did not exist unless absolutely necessary. But I had believed, foolishly, that love would be enough. I had believed that my devotion would eventually melt the frost of aristocratic disdain. I had believed that if I was good enough, kind enough, patient enough, I would earn my place in Gregory's world. I had believed so many things that I look back upon now with the tender sorrow one reserves for the illusions of youth. The marriage revealed its true nature within months. Gregory was not cruel in obvious ways. He did not strike me or shout or rage. His cruelty was quieter, more insidious, a systematic diminishment that left me doubting my own perceptions. He questioned my memory, insisting that conversations I clearly recalled had never occurred, that promises he had made were figments of my imagination. He mocked my opinions in company, and then denied having done so when we were alone. He controlled the household accounts so completely that I had to request money for the smallest purchases, and his approval or denial seemed designed to keep me perpetually uncertain of my standing. I began to feel like a ghost in my own home, present but not quite real, visible but not truly seen. The servants looked through me as if I were made of glass. The guests at our infrequent social gatherings spoke over me as if my contributions to conversation were not worth acknowledging. And Gregory, my husband, the man who had pursued me with such apparent ardor, treated me with a distant civility that was somehow worse than open hostility. At least hatred would have been an emotion. His indifference suggested I was not worth even that. When he announced his intention to seek an annulment, I was almost relieved. The pretense of marriage had become exhausting, and some part of me welcomed the prospect of freedom, even if that freedom came at the cost of everything I had. The grounds he chose, however, transformed relief into horror. He claimed that I had fraudulently represented myself as a woman of respectable family when in fact I was base-born, possibly illegitimate, certainly unworthy of the Pemberton name. He had hired investigators, he said, to trace my origins, and what they had found was damning. I was the daughter of a seamstress who had died in poverty. My father was unknown. I had been raised in orphanages and charity schools, a ward of institutions rather than a child of lineage. None of this was false. I had never hidden my origins from Gregory. I had told him, before our engagement, that I was an orphan of humble birth, that I knew little of my parents, that I had made my own way in the world through work and determination. He had said it did not matter. He had said that what mattered was the woman I had become, not the circumstances of my birth. He had said that he loved me, and love transcended such petty considerations as family trees and social standing. He had lied, and I had believed him, because I wanted so desperately to believe that someone could love me without conditions, that I could be enough simply as myself, without pedigree or dowry or the kind of connections that open doors in polite society. The courtroom proceedings stretched through that long morning, and I felt myself shrinking with each passing hour. Whitmore called witnesses who testified to my unremarkable background. A matron from the orphanage where I had spent my early years, a stern woman with gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her skin. She spoke of me as one speaks of a piece of furniture that has served its purpose and been moved to the attic without affection or animosity, merely with the detachment of someone describing something that no longer matters. A former employer confirmed that I had worked as a governess, praised my competence, but noted that I had always been somewhat above myself, reaching for books and ideas beyond my station. Each testimony was accurate in its facts and devastating in its implications. I was exactly who Gregory claimed I was, a woman of no consequence who had dared to reach above her station. When the noon recess was called, I escaped to a small antechamber where petitioners could wait in privacy. The room was cold and sparsely furnished, with a single window that looked out on the gray London street below. I stood by that window and watched the crowds moving through the thoroughfare, ordinary people going about their ordinary lives, unaware that in a room above them a woman was being systematically erased from existence. A flower seller called out her wares. A pair of gentlemen in top hats argued about something, their breath forming clouds in the chilly air. A child ran past, chasing a hoop with a stick, laughing at some private joy. I had no family to stand with me, no friends with sufficient standing to speak on my behalf, no resources to mount a proper defense. My solicitor, a tired man named Mr. Fairweather, who had taken my case more from pity than expectation of payment, had already advised me to accept whatever settlement Gregory offered. Fighting, he said, would only prolong my disgrace. Better to take what I could and disappear quietly into the obscurity from which I had briefly emerged. It was there, in that antechamber, with the cold seeping through the window glass and the sounds of the street below muffled by distance, that I first saw him. He entered without knocking, which should have offended me, but somehow did not. Perhaps I was too exhausted for offense. Perhaps something in his manner suggested that conventional courtesies were simply not relevant to whatever business had brought him here. He was tall and lean, with the kind of face that seemed designed for shadows, all angles and hollows that the dim light accentuated rather than softened. His clothes were well made but worn, the attire of a man who had once had money and retained the taste for quality even after the means to afford it had diminished. His eyes were gray, not the gentle gray of morning mist, but the harder gray of winter stone, and they studied me with an intensity that made me feel, for the first time that day, genuinely seen. He introduced himself as Adrian Hale, a private inquiry agent, and his voice carried an accent that I could not quite place, something beneath the educated London tones that suggested origins as complicated as my own. Perhaps a childhood in the north, overlaid with years of careful cultivation. Perhaps a past he had worked to obscure, as I had never quite managed to obscure mine. He asked if he might speak with me on a matter of some urgency, and I, having nothing left to lose, agreed. What he told me in the next quarter hour changed the entire trajectory of my existence. He had been investigating, he said, a matter connected to a death that had occurred 15 years prior. The death of Samuel Blackwood, the railway magnate whose fortune had built half the tracks that now crisscross the British Isles. Mr. Blackwood had been a legend in his time, a self-made man who had risen from modest beginnings to become one of the wealthiest individuals in the empire. His trains connected cities that had once been days apart, carried goods and passengers across distances that previous generations had considered insurmountable, transformed the very fabric of British life in ways that were still being understood. He had died under circumstances officially deemed accidental, but long rumored to be suspicious. A fall on the stairs of his London mansion, late at night, when the servants had gone to bed and only his wife was present to witness his demise. The inquest had been brief, the verdict of accidental death delivered with suspicious speed, and his estate had passed into the control of trustees appointed by his widow, Lady Constance Blackwood, who had declared that her husband left no living heirs. Adrian Hale believed this declaration to be false. More specifically, he believed that Samuel Blackwood had fathered a daughter outside his marriage, a daughter whose existence had been deliberately concealed, and that this daughter was entitled to the entirety of the Blackwood fortune. He believed that daughter was me. I remember laughing. It was not a pleasant sound, more a release of tension than genuine amusement, and it echoed strangely in that small room with its cold window and bare walls. I told him that if this was some elaborate mockery, some additional cruelty arranged by my husband to deepen my humiliation, he could tell Gregory that his efforts were unnecessary. I was already quite thoroughly destroyed. There was nothing left to demolish. Adrian Hale did not smile. His face remained grave, almost gentle, as if he understood that what he was about to show me would shake the foundations of everything I thought I knew about myself. He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio, and from this portfolio he produced documents that he spread across the small table between us. A birth certificate for a child named Eleanor, daughter of Catherine Wren, born in the year 1862. The paper was yellowed with age, the handwriting faded but still legible, the official seals and signatures intact. A certificate of baptism from a church in Hampstead, recording the christening of the same Eleanor, daughter of Catherine, godparents unknown. Letters, dozens of them, tied with ribbon that had once been blue but had faded to gray, written in a hand I did not recognize but addressed to my darling Catherine with a devotion that made my throat tighten. And finally a photograph, small and faded, showing a man with dark hair and serious eyes holding an infant in his arms. The man was looking at the child with an expression of such unguarded tenderness that it hurt to see, and on the back of the photograph, in the same hand that had written the letters, were the words, "My daughter, my little star." I stared at these documents for what felt like hours. The sounds of the street below faded. The cold of the room ceased to register. There was only this table, these papers, this photograph of a man I did not recognize, holding a baby who might have been me. Catherine Wren was my mother's name. I knew that much from the records of the orphanage where I had been placed after her death. I had been 6 years old when she died, old enough to remember fragments, young enough that those fragments had grown hazy and uncertain with time. I remembered dark hair and gentle hands and a voice that sang me to sleep with songs whose words I could no longer recall. I remembered a small room that smelled of fabric and thread, needles and pins arranged in careful order, scraps of cloth in colors that seemed magical to my young eyes. I remembered being happy there, safe in a way that I had never felt safe since. And I remembered, or thought I remembered, a man who visited sometimes. A man whose face I could never quite recall, but whose presence had meant gifts and laughter and a kind of safety that vanished when he stopped coming. He had brought me sweets, I thought. He had lifted me up so I could see things that were too high for my small eyes to reach. He had called me something, a name, an endearment, something that had made me feel precious and loved. My little star. Adrian Hale told me what he had pieced together from months of investigation. Samuel Blackwood had met Catherine Wren when she was employed as a seamstress at a theatrical company that he patronized. The company produced melodramas and light operas in a theater on the Strand, entertainment that Samuel enjoyed more than the grand opera his social position demanded he attend. Catherine had been responsible for the costumes, transforming actors into kings and queens, villains and heroes, with nothing but fabric and skill and an eye for detail that had caught Samuel's attention. Their affair lasted nearly a decade, conducted in secret to protect both his reputation and her livelihood. He was a married man, bound to a wife he did not love but could not abandon without scandal. She was a working woman, dependent on her employment and vulnerable to the whispers that could destroy a reputation overnight. They met when they could, in borrowed rooms and country cottages, stealing hours and days from lives that demanded they remain apart. When Catherine became pregnant, Samuel had provided for her generously, setting her up in comfortable lodgings in a respectable neighborhood, ensuring that she would want for nothing. He visited as often as his public life permitted, sometimes weekly, sometimes less often when business or society demanded his attention elsewhere. But he never forgot her, and he never forgot the child they had made together. He had loved her, Adrian said, with a constancy that was remarkable for a man of his position and time. The letters made that clear. They were not the casual notes of a wealthy man maintaining a convenient arrangement. They were love letters, passionate and tender by turns, filled with longing for the life they could not openly share, and gratitude for the stolen moments they did have. He wrote of his dreams for their daughter, the education he would provide, the opportunities he would create, the future he hoped to give her, even if he could never publicly acknowledge her as his own. And he had loved their daughter with a devotion that bordered on obsession. The letters spoke of her constantly. Her first words, her first steps, the clever things she said and did, the way her eyes lit up when she saw him. He called her his little star, his greatest joy, the one true good thing he had done in a life otherwise consumed by business and social obligation. But Samuel Blackwood had a wife, and Lady Constance was not a woman who accepted rivals, even rivals she did not officially acknowledge. Adrian had found evidence that Constance had known about Catherine and the child almost from the beginning. She had employed agents to monitor her husband's movements, to track his expenditures, to document every visit he made to the modest house in Hampstead where his other family lived. She had said nothing, done nothing, waited with the patience of a predator for the right moment to strike. When Samuel died in 1874, supposedly from a fall on the stairs of his London mansion, Constance moved quickly to secure her control over his estate. She dismissed servants who had been loyal to Samuel, replacing them with people who owed their positions to her alone. She destroyed correspondence, burning letters and documents that might have revealed secrets she wished to keep buried. She hired men, discreet and ruthless, to ensure that any evidence of her husband's illegitimate daughter disappeared from official records. Catherine Wren died 2 years later, ostensibly from consumption. But Adrian had found records suggesting that her final illness had progressed with suspicious rapidity after a visit from strangers she had described to neighbors as frightening men who asked too many questions. The neighbors remembered her distress, her fear, the way she had kept her daughter close and refused to let her out of her sight in those final weeks. They remembered, too, the men who had come to the funeral, men who had spoken to no one and left without a word, their purpose unknown, but their presence unsettling. Little Eleanor was placed in an orphanage by authorities who found no family to claim her. The records that might have identified her father had disappeared. The letters and photographs that Catherine had treasured were gone, taken or destroyed by whoever had come to that small house in the days after her death. Lady Constance Blackwood presumably considered the matter closed, the threat eliminated, her control of her husband's fortune secured. But Samuel Blackwood had been cleverer than his wife anticipated. Before his death, sensing perhaps that his life was in danger, he had prepared a secret testament, hidden with a solicitor who had instructions to deliver it only when certain conditions were met. That solicitor had been a young man at the time, newly established in his practice, trusted precisely because he was not connected to the networks of influence that Lady Constance controlled. He had kept the document safe for years, uncertain how to proceed, fearful of the powerful forces that might be arrayed against anyone who challenged the official account of the Blackwood succession. The solicitor had died recently, his conscience troubled by the secret he had carried for so long, and his son had discovered the document among his father's private papers. The son, a man of more courage than his father had possessed, had contacted Adrian Hale, whose reputation for discretion and tenacity made him a logical choice for such a delicate matter. The testament named Catherine Wren's daughter as Samuel Blackwood's sole heir, superseding all previous wills and rendering Lady Constance's administration of the estate legally void. It was signed, witnessed, and sealed with Samuel Blackwood's personal crest, a document that would stand up to any legal challenge if its authenticity could be established. I asked Adrian, in a voice that did not sound like my own, why he was telling me this. Why now, on the very day when I was being publicly declared a fraud and a fortune hunter? Why approach me when I was at my lowest, my most vulnerable, my most desperate? His answer was not the answer I expected. He told me, with a bluntness that I would come to recognize as characteristic, that he had originally been hired by Lady Constance Blackwood herself. She had learned, through her network of informants, that the hidden testament had surfaced, and she had engaged Adrian to find it and destroy it before it could threaten her control of the Blackwood fortune. She had known about me all along, had tracked my movements through agents and informers for years, had always known that the threat I represented to her position had not been eliminated, only deferred. She had pointed Adrian toward me, believing that I might possess papers left by my mother, documents or letters that Catherine might have hidden away against the possibility that her daughter would someday need proof of her parentage. She had instructed Adrian to obtain these papers by whatever means necessary, to search my lodgings, to question anyone who might have information, to find and destroy any evidence that could be used to challenge her control. He had followed her instructions at first. He had investigated my background, traced my movements, even, he admitted with a directness that surprised me, broken into my modest lodgings to search for documents while I was attending the early hearings of my annulment case. He had gone through my possessions with methodical thoroughness, looking for hidden compartments, secret papers, anything that might serve as proof. He had found nothing, because there was nothing to find. Whatever papers my mother might have possessed had been lost or destroyed decades ago. But in the course of his investigation, something had shifted. He had read the letters Samuel Blackwood had written to Catherine Wren, and those letters had affected him in ways he had not anticipated. He had studied the testament in which a dying man had poured out his love for a daughter he knew he would never see grow to womanhood, and the raw emotion in that document had broken through the professional detachment he had cultivated over years of doing work that respectable people needed done but did not want to acknowledge. He had watched me, from a distance, navigating the humiliations of my legal proceedings with a quiet courage that he said reminded him of someone he had once failed to protect. He had seen me stand in that courtroom, alone and unsupported, refusing to break even as the machinery of society ground against me. And he had realized that he could not be party to my destruction, not for Lady Constance Blackwood's money, not for any amount of money. He had made a decision. He would not destroy the evidence. He would bring it to me instead, along with everything he had learned, and let me decide what to do with the truth. I asked him what he expected in return. In my experience, men did not offer gifts without expecting payment, and this gift, if genuine, was beyond anything I could ever hope to repay. He said he expected nothing. He said that his reasons were his own, and that I was under no obligation to trust him or to act on the information he had provided. He said that if I chose to pursue my claim to the Blackwood estate, he would assist me, but if I chose instead to walk away from this entire sordid business, he would respect that decision and trouble me no further. Then he gathered his documents, returned them to his portfolio, and left me alone in that antechamber with my thoughts churning like a storm-tossed sea. The afternoon session of the court reconvened without me having reached any decision at all. I sat through more testimony, more insinuations, more barely concealed contempt from the gallery. Gregory's barrister was building toward his climax, the request for annulment that would officially declare my marriage a fraud and my husband an innocent victim of feminine deception. I listened as if from a great distance, my mind still turning over everything Adrian Hale had told me. Could it be true? Could I really be the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in England? Could my mother, the seamstress I barely remembered, have been the secret love of a railway magnate? It seemed impossible, the stuff of penny novels and theatrical melodramas rather than real life. And yet the documents had looked genuine, had felt genuine, had carried the weight of authenticity that forgeries, no matter how skillful, can never quite replicate. The letters had been written with an emotion that seemed too raw, too specific, to be fabricated. And the photograph, that small, faded image of a man holding an infant with such obvious tenderness, had awakened something in me that felt less like new knowledge than like recovered memory. My little star. Someone had called me that long ago. I was almost certain of it. The session adjourned without a final ruling. The judge required time to consider the evidence, he said, and would render his decision within the week. Gregory swept out of the courtroom with his entourage, not sparing me a glance. The gallery dispersed, their appetite for spectacle temporarily satisfied. I gathered my things and walked out into the gray London afternoon, uncertain where to go or what to do next. Adrian Hale was waiting on the courthouse steps. He fell into step beside me without invitation, matching his pace to mine as we walked through streets slick with recent rain. The cobblestones gleamed in the diffused light, and the smell of wet stone and coal smoke hung in the air. Carriages rattled past, their passengers hidden behind rain-spattered windows. Newsboys called out headlines about politics and crime, their voices competing with the rumble of traffic and the distant clatter of construction. He asked if I had given thought to what he had told me, and I said I had thought of little else. He asked if I intended to pursue my claim, and I said I did not know. The obstacles seemed insurmountable. Lady Constance Blackwood had money, influence, and 15 years of established control over an estate that powerful people had come to depend upon. She had friends in Parliament, connections in the courts, a network of allies and dependents who would fight to protect the status quo. I had nothing but a handful of old documents and the word of a private inquiry agent who had admitted to originally working against me. Adrian stopped walking. We had reached a small square where pigeons gathered around a dry fountain, the basin cracked and discolored from years of neglect. The houses around the square had once been grand, but their facades showed signs of decline, paint peeling, windows clouded with grime, a general air of faded gentility that spoke of better days long past. He turned to face me with those gray eyes that revealed so little and demanded so much. He told me that the obstacles were real but not insurmountable. He told me that Lady Constance's position was more precarious than it appeared, built on lies that could be exposed with the right evidence presented in the right forum. The trustees who administered the Blackwood estate were growing restless, he said, suspicious of Lady Constance's management, resentful of her high-handed treatment of their concerns. Several of them would welcome a challenge to her authority, especially a challenge supported by documentary evidence that could be verified by independent experts. He told me that he had spent his career learning the vulnerable points of power, the places where the mighty could be brought low by nothing more than documented truth. He had brought down corrupt officials and exposed fraudulent businessmen. He had proved murders that had been disguised as accidents and revealed inheritances that had been stolen through forgery and deceit. The powerful were not invulnerable. They only seemed so because most people never dared to test their defenses. If I was willing to trust him, he believed we could win. I asked him why he cared. A stranger's inheritance was no concern of his, and his admission that he had originally been hired to destroy me made his sudden helpfulness suspicious at best. Men did not simply change sides out of sentiment. There had to be something more, some angle I was not seeing, some advantage he hoped to gain. He was silent for a long moment. The pigeons cooed around us, pecking at the wet stones. A woman walked past with a basket of laundry, glancing at us curiously before hurrying on her way. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell began to toll the hour. Then he told me, in a voice stripped of his usual detachment, that he had once been a detective inspector with Scotland Yard. He had been young and idealistic, fresh from university, determined to use his education and his abilities to serve justice. He had been good at his work, perhaps too good, because he had begun investigating a case that led to powerful people who did not wish to be investigated. A ring of men who traded in human misery, who profited from the desperation of the poor and vulnerable, who had connections that reached into the highest levels of government and society. Evidence had been planted in his rooms, evidence that suggested he was corrupt, that he had taken bribes, that he had betrayed the very principles he claimed to serve. Accusations had been made by witnesses who had been paid or threatened into compliance. He had been dismissed in disgrace, his reputation destroyed, his career ended before it had truly begun. The newspapers had called him a traitor to his badge. Former colleagues had crossed the street to avoid him. The life he had built, the future he had imagined, had collapsed around him like a house of cards. He had survived by taking private commissions, doing the work that respectable people needed done but did not want to acknowledge. Finding missing persons, gathering evidence for divorce proceedings, investigating business rivals. It was not the work he had dreamed of, but it was work he could do, and it kept him from the kind of desperation that drove men to worse choices. He had accepted Lady Constance's commission because he needed the money and because he had stopped believing that his choices mattered. The world was corrupt, the powerful were untouchable, and any attempt to fight them would only lead to more destruction. Better to take what was offered and not ask too many questions. Better to survive than to struggle against forces that could not be overcome. But reading Samuel Blackwood's letters had reminded him of something he had forgotten. There were still innocent people who deserved justice. There were still truths worth fighting for. There were still moments when the right choice was clear, even if the right choice was dangerous. And I, standing in that courtroom being systematically dismantled by lies, had reminded him of himself in the months after his fall, when he had believed that his own worthlessness had been proven beyond dispute. He had seen the same despair in my eyes that he had once seen in his own reflection. He had recognized the same determination to maintain dignity even when dignity seemed like all that remained. He wanted to help me, he said, because helping me was a way of proving to himself that he was still capable of choosing the right side. He did not expect me to trust him. He knew that trust, once betrayed, is not easily restored. But he was asking for the chance to earn it. I looked at this man, this stranger who had laid his failures bare before me with an honesty that was almost painful to witness. The gray light of the afternoon softened his features, made him look younger and more vulnerable than he had seemed in the harsh illumination of the antechamber. I thought of all the people who had promised me things, Gregory's promises of love and protection, the orphanage matron's promises that hard work would lead to a respectable life, society's implicit promises that virtue and dignity would be rewarded. None of those promises had been kept. Why should I believe that Adrian Hale's promises would be any different? But there was something in his eyes, something beneath the hardness, that made me think he understood what it meant to be broken and to keep going anyway. And I realized, standing in that gray square with pigeons cooing around my feet and the smell of rain heavy in the air, that I had nothing left to lose. Gregory was going to win his annulment. Society had already judged me. My reputation was destroyed, my resources exhausted, my future a blank wall against which I could see no door. If Adrian Hale was lying to me, I would be no worse off than I already was. And if he was telling the truth, then perhaps, just perhaps, I had been handed a weapon with which to fight back. I told him I would pursue the claim. I told him I would trust him, provisionally, until he gave me reason not to. And I told him that if he betrayed me, I would find a way to make him regret it, even if that way took me the rest of my life to discover. He almost smiled. It was just a flicker, quickly suppressed, but it transformed his face for an instant into something younger and less guarded. For a moment, I caught a glimpse of the man he might have been before the world had taught him caution, and something stirred in me that I refused to examine too closely. He said he would do his best not to give me cause for regret. We began our work that very evening, in the cramped offices Adrian maintained in an unfashionable corner of the city. The building was old, its stairs creaking beneath our feet, its walls stained with the smoke of countless coal fires. His rooms occupied the third floor, accessed by a narrow door with paint peeling in long strips. Inside, the space smelled of old paper and coal smoke and something else, something like determination, if determination could have a scent. Every surface was covered with documents, photographs, maps, and newspaper clippings from investigations past and present. Files were stacked on chairs and tables and along the walls. A large desk dominated the center of the room, its surface barely visible beneath layers of correspondence and notes. Gas lamps cast unsteady shadows that made the piles of paper seem to move and shift like living things. Adrian cleared a space at a battered table near the window and spread out everything he had gathered on the Blackwood case. He talked me through each piece of evidence with a methodical precision that reminded me that he had once been trained to build cases that would stand up in court. Here was the testament, with its careful language and official seals. Here were the letters, arranged in chronological order, documenting the relationship between my father and mother from its hopeful beginning to its abrupt end. Here were records he had obtained from various sources, birth certificates and death certificates, financial transactions and property records, a paper trail that led from Catherine Wren's modest life to the vast Blackwood fortune. The central document was Samuel Blackwood's secret testament, dated 3 weeks before his death. In it, he acknowledged Catherine Wren as his common-law wife, a relationship that, while not legally binding in the strict sense, demonstrated his intent and his devotion. He acknowledged me as his daughter and sole heir, describing me in terms that made my heart ache, the light of my life, the joy I never expected, the one good thing I will leave behind me when I am gone. He expressed his fear that his health was failing, and his suspicion that someone in his household wished him ill. He did not name Lady Constance directly, but the implication was clear. He begged the solicitor holding this document to ensure that his daughter received her inheritance, and that Lady Constance be prevented from erasing all evidence of his love for Catherine and the child they had made together. He had known what was coming. He had tried to protect me, even as he failed to protect himself. It was a damning document, but Adrian warned me that it would not be enough on its own. Lady Constance would claim forgery. She would produce experts who would question the handwriting, the paper, the provenance. She would deploy her considerable social influence to discredit any attempt to challenge her control. We needed more. We needed to prove that Samuel Blackwood had indeed been murdered, and that Lady Constance had orchestrated both his death and the subsequent suppression of his true heir. Over the following weeks, Adrian and I worked together in a partnership that was equal parts intellectual and emotional. He taught me how to read documents for inconsistencies, how to trace connections between seemingly unrelated events, how to question witnesses in ways that elicited truth rather than the answers they thought you wanted to hear. I brought my own skills to the work, the observational abilities I had developed as a governess, watching children and their parents, learning to read the unspoken dynamics of households, the patience I had cultivated through years of navigating difficult families, the intuition about human nature that came from having survived on the margins of society. We made an unlikely pair, the disgraced detective and the humiliated wife. But perhaps that was why we worked so well together. Neither of us had anything to prove to society anymore. Neither of us cared about the propriety that might have kept us at a careful distance if we had been respectable people with reputations to protect. We worked side by side for hours that stretched into days, sharing meals of bread and cheese and cold tea when we forgot to eat properly, arguing about interpretations of evidence with a frankness that would have scandalized any drawing room in London. I began to notice things about him. The way he rubbed his temples when a problem refused to yield, as if he could massage the solution out of his own skull. The way his voice softened when he spoke of his late mother, the only family member he ever mentioned, a woman who had died when he was young and whom he still seemed to mourn. The way he listened when I talked, really listened, as if my thoughts had value beyond their utility to our investigation, as if what I felt and believed mattered to him for its own sake. I had never been listened to like that. Gregory had heard my words only to find ways to contradict or dismiss them. My employers had heard only what pertained to their children's education. Adrian heard me, the whole of me, and the experience was intoxicating in ways I did not fully understand. I also began to notice the moments when something darker crossed his face. He would grow silent sometimes, staring at nothing, his gray eyes going distant, as if he were seeing something that existed only in memory. I learned not to interrupt these silences. Whatever haunted him was not something he was ready to share, and I respected that boundary even as I found myself wishing he would let me in. Our investigation led us through the hidden layers of Victorian society. We visited the church in Hampstead, where I had been baptized, a small stone building with a graveyard so overgrown that the tombstones seemed to be rising from a sea of green. The elderly verger who tended the grounds remembered the christening, remembered it vividly, even after all these years. The gentleman had wept, he told us, had held the baby as if she were made of glass, had spoken to her in words too soft for the verger to hear. It had been clear to everyone present that this child was loved, truly and deeply loved, whatever the irregularities of her parentage. We tracked down former servants from the Blackwood household, some living in comfort provided by generous pensions, others in poverty, after being dismissed without references when Lady Constance consolidated her control. Those who would speak to us told stories of a household divided, of a master who loved a woman other than his wife, of tensions that had built for years before exploding in tragedy. They spoke of Lady Constance's coldness, her meticulous attention to appearance, her absolute determination to control everything and everyone within her sphere. One former housemaid, now an elderly woman living in a room above a pub in Whitechapel, told us about the night Samuel Blackwood died. The pub was noisy and smelled of spilled ale and unwashed bodies, but the woman's room was clean, decorated with small treasures she had preserved from better days. She had been working late that night, she said, polishing silver in the butler's pantry, when she had seen Lady Constance leaving the master's study shortly before the alarm was raised. Lady Constance's manner had been strange, the woman recalled, calm, almost satisfied, as if something long anticipated had finally come to pass. She had walked slowly, deliberately, with none of the hurry one might expect from a woman whose husband was about to be found dead at the foot of the stairs. When the body was discovered, Lady Constance had wept and wailed with theatrical grief, but the housemaid had never believed those tears were genuine. There had been something cold behind them, something calculating, something that had sent a chill down her spine, even as she joined the other servants in the chaos of that terrible night. This was hearsay, Adrian warned me, not proof, but it was another thread in the tapestry we were weaving, another indication that the official story of Samuel Blackwood's death did not hold up to scrutiny. More troubling were the connections we discovered between Lady Constance and my husband. Gregory Pemberton's family had been in financial difficulty for years, their estates mortgaged, their income insufficient to maintain their position in society. The grand house where I had lived as Gregory's wife was owned, we learned, not by the Pemberton family, but by a trust whose ultimate beneficiary was impossible to trace. Gregory's debts had been paid, his creditors satisfied, by money that appeared to come from anonymous sources, but that Adrian, with his talent for following paper trails, eventually traced back to Lady Constance Blackwood. She had provided loans, quietly, through intermediaries who were expert at concealing the true source of funds. She had also introduced Gregory to Lionel, her own illegitimate son, whom she had spent years grooming to take his place as Blackwood heir. Lionel was a man of 30 now, educated at the best schools, established in society with a reputation for charm and ambition. He and Gregory had become close friends, business partners, and co-conspirators in plans that only became clear when we understood the full scope of their scheme. My marriage to Gregory had not been coincidence, it had been calculated. Lady Constance had known about me all along, had tracked my movements through agents and informers, had known that the threat I represented to her control had not been eliminated, only deferred. When I emerged from obscurity as a governess of good reputation, when I attracted the attention of a nobleman, Lady Constance had seen an opportunity. Better to have me married to an ally, controlled and contained, than to have me floating loose in the world where I might someday discover the truth. Gregory's role was to keep me dependent and isolated. The psychological manipulation, the financial control, the systematic undermining of my confidence, all of it had been designed to make me incapable of fighting back if I ever learned who I truly was. The annulment proceedings were meant to destroy me completely, to render me so discredited that even if I somehow discovered my parentage, no court would take my claims seriously. I would be dismissed as a fortune-hunting fraud, and Lady Constance's control would remain unchallenged. The depths of this conspiracy left me reeling. I had believed my marriage was simply unhappy, one of the countless unhappy marriages that society tolerated and even encouraged. I had not imagined that it was a prison designed specifically for me, that every slight and manipulation had been part of a deliberate plan. The realization made me feel simultaneously more foolish and more certain. Foolish for having missed so many signs, for having trusted when trust was not warranted, for having hoped when hope was a trap. But certain, absolutely certain, that I would not rest until I had exposed everyone responsible for the destruction they had wrought. It was during this period that the visions began. I hesitate to call them visions. Even now, after all these years, I am not certain what they truly were. They came at unpredictable moments, during the quiet hours of the night when sleep proved elusive, or in the drowsy transitions between sleep and waking when the mind wanders through territories it cannot name. I would see images, feel sensations that seemed to belong to a past I did not consciously remember. A man with graying hair and kind eyes lifting me onto his shoulders so I could see a parade passing in the street below. The crowd was cheering, flags were waving, and I was laughing with the pure joy of childhood, secure in his grip, certain that I would never fall. A room filled with clocks, dozens of them, all ticking at slightly different rhythms, creating a symphony of mechanical heartbeats. The same man was there, explaining how the gears and springs work together to mark the passage of time, his voice patient and warm, delighted by my questions, even when I did not understand the answers. A Persian carpet, deep red and intricately patterned, and on it a dark stain that frightened me for reasons I could not articulate. The fear was old and deep, the kind of fear that settles into bones and becomes part of who you are. And always, always, a voice calling me little star, my little star, with such tenderness that I would wake with tears on my face and an ache in my chest that felt older than memory. I mentioned these experiences to Adrian hesitantly, expecting skepticism or dismissal. He was a man of evidence and logic, trained in the rational methods of criminal investigation, not given to entertaining flights of fancy or supernatural explanations. He had never spoken of religion or spirituality, except with the detached interest of an observer studying phenomena he did not share. But he listened without judgment, his gray eyes focused on my face with the same intensity he brought to examining documents or questioning witnesses. When I had finished, he asked me to describe the room with the clocks in as much detail as I could manage. I closed my eyes and let myself sink back into the vision. I told him what I saw. Tall grandfather clocks with brass pendulums that swung with hypnotic regularity, smaller mantel clocks with painted faces showing scenes from mythology or pastoral life. A peculiar device on a shelf that seemed to mark not hours, but something else entirely, something I could not understand. I described the quality of the light, golden and warm, filtering through windows that looked out on a garden I could not quite see. I described the smell of oil and metal and wood polish, the feeling of being very small in a room full of mechanisms far more complex than I could understand, but feeling safe nonetheless because the man with the kind eyes was there. Adrian left the room and returned with a photograph he had obtained during his initial investigation. It showed an interior space, a study or workshop, and in that photograph I saw the same clocks I had seen in my vision. The grandfather clock with the brass pendulum positioned in exactly the place I had described, the mantel clocks on their shelves, the peculiar device, which I could now see more clearly, some kind of astronomical instrument designed to track the movements of heavenly bodies. It was Samuel Blackwood's private study, Adrian told me. The room where he had spent his final years, indulging his passion for horology and astronomy, surrounding himself with the mechanical marvels he loved. It was the room where he had died, at the foot of the stairs, just outside its door. A room I had never visited, a room I could not possibly have seen, and yet a room I had described with accuracy that left us both shaken. I do not know what to make of this even now. Perhaps I had seen photographs as a child that my conscious mind had forgotten, but my deeper memory retained. My mother might have possessed images of my father's home, might have shown them to me in those early years before her death, might have described the rooms and furnishings in ways that planted seeds that only now were blooming into conscious awareness. Perhaps I had absorbed details from the letters Samuel Blackwood had written to my mother, details that created images vivid enough to seem like recollections. Or perhaps, as the spiritualists of that era believed, the bonds of love do not end with death, and those who loved us remain in some form, guiding and protecting us from beyond the veil. I had attended seances in the years after my mother's death, drawn by the hope that I might somehow contact her, receive some message from beyond. I had seen things at those gatherings that I could not explain, and I had seen things that were obviously fraudulent. The world of the spirits, if it existed, was not easily separated from the world of charlatans who exploited grief for profit. Adrian, ever the rationalist, inclined toward the first explanations. Memory was unreliable, he said. The mind had ways of constructing coherent narratives from fragments and suggestions. I might have seen a photograph, read a description, heard a conversation, and assembled these pieces into something that felt like direct experience, but was actually a kind of mental collage. But I noticed that he did not dismiss the possibility of something more. And when I told him of the vision of the Persian carpet with its dark stain, he grew very still. The official account of Samuel Blackwood's death stated that he had fallen on the stairs and struck his head. There had been blood, but it had been on the marble steps, explained by the injury from the fall. No mention had been made of blood elsewhere. The death had been ruled accidental, the inquest perfunctory, the case closed before any serious investigation could be conducted. But Adrian had found, in the records of a physician who had attended the scene that night, a notation that seemed to have been overlooked or deliberately suppressed. A stain on the carpet of the study. A stain that the physician had believed was blood, but that had been cleaned away before any formal investigation could be conducted. A stain that suggested Samuel Blackwood might have been injured in his study, perhaps attacked there, before being moved to the stairs to create the appearance of an accident. I had seen that stain. I had seen it in a vision of a room I had never visited, a room I could not possibly remember, and in that moment, standing in Adrian's cluttered office with the evidence of conspiracy spread around us and the gas lamps casting their uncertain light, I felt something shift in my understanding of the world. There are more things in heaven and earth, Hamlet tells Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. I had never truly believed that until then. The weeks passed, and our case grew stronger. We gathered affidavits from witnesses willing to speak, their testimonies carefully documented and notarized. We obtained expert testimony verifying the authenticity of Samuel Blackwood's testament and letters, enlisting Dr. Alistair Vance, the foremost authority on document authentication in the British Isles. We documented the financial connections between Lady Constance and the Pemberton family, the pattern of payments and favors that suggested a long-term conspiracy stretching back more than a decade. We prepared our evidence with the meticulous care of surgeons preparing for an operation, knowing that one mistake could be fatal. Every document was copied and secured in multiple locations. Every witness was interviewed multiple times to ensure consistency. Every claim was supported by corroborating evidence, leaving no gap that our opponents could exploit. Through it all, the connection between Adrian and me deepened in ways neither of us acknowledged directly. We spoke of the case, of evidence and strategy, and the moves our opponents might make. We did not speak of the way our hands brushed when we reached for the same document, sending small shocks of awareness through my skin. We did not speak of the way our eyes met, sometimes across the table, and held for moments longer than necessary, communicating something that words would have made too real. We did not speak of the way my pulse quickened when I heard his footsteps on the stairs leading to his office, or the way he seemed to stand slightly closer to me than professional necessity required. I was still married, legally if not emotionally. The annulment proceedings remained unresolved, suspended in bureaucratic limbo while our countercase took shape. Adrian had given no indication that his interest in me extended beyond the professional, and I had my dignity to consider. I would not throw myself at a man who might not want me, especially a man whose help I desperately needed and whose partnership I could not afford to jeopardize with unwanted advances. So I kept my feelings locked away, adding them to the collection of silences that had always defined my life, and I pretended that my heart did not leap every time he said my name. The court reconvened to hear Gregory's final arguments in early December, as fog settled over London and the cold seeped into every corner and crevice of the city. He had no idea what was coming. Neither did Lady Constance, who sat in the gallery that day with the serene confidence of a woman who believed she had already won. I saw her when I entered, her silver hair immaculate beneath a black lace cap, her black silk rustling as she turned to watch me take my seat. Our eyes met, and in hers I saw a hatred so cold and so old that it took my breath away. She knew who I was. She had always known. And she had spent 15 years ensuring that I would never become a threat. Gregory's barrister rose to deliver his closing statement. He summarized the case with theatrical flourish, his voice rising and falling like a preacher's, his gestures calculated to draw the eye and hold attention. Here was a humble woman of no family who had deceived a noble lord. Here was a fraud perpetrated against not just an individual, but against the entire institution of marriage. Here was a wrong that could only be righted by annulling the union and restoring Lord Pemberton to the status of an unwed man, free to make a more suitable match. He requested, additionally, that I be declared mentally unstable and committed to an asylum for observation. He had obtained statements, he claimed, from witnesses who would testify to my erratic behavior, my wild claims of persecution, my delusional belief that I was someone of importance rather than the nobody I truly was. The asylum, he mentioned, was a place I knew by reputation, a place where inconvenient women were sent to disappear, their sanity questioned until they doubted it themselves, their spirits broken by treatments designed to cure conditions that existed only in the minds of those who wished them silenced. The gallery buzzed with anticipation. Lady Constance leaned forward slightly, her gloved hands clasped in her lap, her eyes bright with satisfaction. Gregory finally looked at me, and in his face I saw triumph tempered by contempt. He believed this was my end. He believed I would be led from that courtroom, a broken woman, destined for the horrors of Victorian asylum care, never to trouble him or his patrons again. The judge asked if I had any response to these arguments. I rose. My heart was pounding so loudly I was certain everyone in the room could hear it, a drumbeat of fear and determination that seemed to fill my entire body. But my voice, when I spoke, was steady. The voice of a woman who had faced worse than this courtroom and survived. I said that I did indeed have a response, but that I would prefer to let others speak on my behalf. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and Adrian Hale entered, followed by Dr. Alistair Vance, his white beard and dignified bearing lending gravitas to our proceedings. Behind them came a solicitor carrying a leather case filled with evidence that we had spent weeks assembling. Behind the solicitor came witnesses, 6 of them, people who had worked in the Blackwood household, people who had known my mother, people who had seen things that Lady Constance believed she had silenced forever. What followed was not a closing argument for an annulment case. It was the opening salvo of a war. Dr. Vance took the stand first. He presented his analysis of Samuel Blackwood's testament, explaining in precise detail how he had verified the handwriting, comparing it to known samples from correspondence and business documents. He discussed the paper, its age and composition, the type of ink used, the patterns of fading and discoloration that could not be replicated by modern forgers. He declared, with the authority of a man whose expertise had never been successfully challenged in 3 decades of court testimony, that the testament was genuine. The letters followed the same pattern. One by one, Dr. Vance authenticated them, building an irrefutable case that Samuel Blackwood had indeed loved Catherine Wren, had indeed fathered a child with her, had indeed intended that child to inherit his fortune. The witnesses followed. One by one, they told their stories. The housemaid who had seen Lady Constance leaving the study on the night of Samuel Blackwood's death. Her calm demeanor so at odds with the tragedy that was about to be discovered. A former secretary who had witnessed the destruction of correspondence between Samuel and Catherine Wren, watching helplessly as letters were fed into flames while Lady Constance stood over him with cold satisfaction. A groundskeeper who had seen Lionel and Gregory meeting in secret on the Blackwood estate just days before my marriage was arranged, their heads bent together in conversation that ceased abruptly when they noticed his approach. A physician's assistant who had records suggesting that Samuel Blackwood's injuries were inconsistent with a simple fall, notes that had been buried and forgotten until Adrian's investigation brought them to light. And finally, Adrian himself took the stand. He presented the full picture of the conspiracy, connecting the dots between evidence and testimony, building a narrative that was impossible to dismiss. He spoke of Lady Constance's fear that her control over the Blackwood fortune would be challenged if Samuel's true heir ever came forward. He spoke of her arrangement with the Pemberton family, the loans and favors exchanged for services rendered. He spoke of the plan to neutralize me through marriage and then destroy me through disgrace. He spoke of me, of Eleanor Blackwood, true and legitimate heir to the Blackwood fortune, daughter of Samuel Blackwood and Catherine Wren, robbed of her birthright by conspiracy and fraud. When he finished, the courtroom was silent. Not the restless silence of boredom, but the stunned silence of people who have witnessed something they cannot quite believe. Lady Constance's face had gone the color of old paper, her composure cracking for the first time since I had known her. Gregory was staring at me with an expression I had never seen before, something between horror and a kind of grudging respect. The judge asked if I had anything to add. I stood again. I looked at the gallery, at the faces of people who had laughed at my humiliation and enjoyed my disgrace. I looked at Lady Constance, who had ordered the death of my father and the destruction of my mother's memory. I looked at Gregory, who had made a mockery of marriage and love, and then I spoke. I told them who I was, not the orphan they believed me to be, not the fortune hunter their whispers had created, but Eleanor Blackwood, daughter of a man who had loved me enough to ensure that the truth would survive even if he did not. I told them what had been done to my family, the murder concealed as accident, the heir hidden away to die in obscurity, the fortune stolen by those who had no right to it. I told them that I was not seeking vengeance, only justice, and that I intended to claim what was rightfully mine. I told them, finally, that I forgave them. The laughers and the gossips, the people who had found entertainment in my pain. I forgave them because I understood now that their cruelty came from ignorance, and because holding on to anger would only poison the life I intended to build. Lady Constance did not wait for the judge's ruling. She rose, swaying slightly, and made for the door with a haste that bordered on panic. But our witnesses included a representative from Scotland Yard, present on Adrian's arrangement, and he intercepted her before she could escape. She collapsed then, whether from genuine distress or calculated performance I never learned, and was carried from the courtroom to face the reckoning she had spent 15 years evading. Lionel was arrested that evening, found trying to board a ship for the continent with a case full of valuables and documents that would have helped him establish a new identity abroad. Gregory was not charged immediately, but the annulment proceedings were dismissed with prejudice, and I was informed that I could pursue charges of fraud and conspiracy at my discretion. I chose not to. Gregory was destroyed by the scandal alone, his family's name dragged through every newspaper in London, his political aspirations shattered, his carefully maintained respectability revealed as a facade covering rot and corruption. His mother died within the year, unable to survive the disgrace that had befallen her house. Gregory himself retreated to a minor property in the country, where he lived out his remaining years in the obscurity he had once intended for me. The legal process of claiming the Blackwood estate took months, filled with motions and counter-motions, challenges and validations, the slow grinding machinery of British inheritance law. Trustees who had administered the fortune for 15 years did not yield their control easily, even when faced with evidence they could not refute. There were hearings and depositions, expert witnesses and cross-examinations, an endless parade of legal procedures that seemed designed more to enrich the lawyers than to serve justice. But the outcome was never seriously in doubt. Samuel Blackwood's testament was genuine. My identity as his daughter was proven beyond question. And Lady Constance, facing charges of conspiracy to commit murder, was in no position to continue contesting my claim. By the spring of 1890, I was officially Eleanor Blackwood, heiress to one of the largest fortunes in England. The money meant less to me than you might imagine. I had spent most of my life with very little, and I had learned that wealth is a tool, not a destination. What mattered was what I could do with it. I funded orphanages and schools, institutions that would give children like myself a chance at something better than the cold charity I had known. I reformed the working conditions on the Blackwood railways, implementing changes that made me unpopular with investors, but beloved by the workers whose lives were improved. I established a foundation in my mother's name to support women artists and artisans, ensuring that other Catherines would have opportunities that had been denied to her. I also confronted, during those months of legal maneuvering, the truth about Adrian Hale. We had continued working together throughout the process, our partnership extending from investigation to litigation support, to the countless practical details of claiming an inheritance that had been contested for 15 years. We spent long hours in each other's company, and the connection between us deepened even as we continued to leave it unspoken. But there was something between us, a barrier that I could feel even when I could not name it. He would grow distant sometimes, pulling away just when I thought we were drawing closer. He would look at me with an expression I could not read, something sad and resigned, and then he would change the subject or find an excuse to leave. I confronted him about it one evening, in his office, with rain streaking the windows and the gas lamps casting unsteady shadows on the walls. The day had been long, the work exhausting, and I was tired of the dance we had been performing for months. I told him that I knew something was wrong, that I could feel him holding back, and that I needed to understand why. He was silent for a long time. The rain tapped against the glass. The gas flames hissed softly. Somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed. Then he told me the truth. When Lady Constance had first hired him, she had provided him with more than just instructions. She had given him documents, forged but convincing, that suggested I was not Samuel Blackwood's daughter at all, that the entire story was an elaborate fraud concocted by enemies of the Blackwood family. She had told him that I was dangerous, a confidence trickster who had already destroyed several wealthy families, and that his job was not just to find evidence, but to ensure that I could never threaten anyone again. He had believed her at first. Why would he not? She was a respected figure, a pillar of society, a woman whose word carried weight. And he, stripped of his position and his reputation, was in no condition to question the motives of a client who paid well and asked only for his skills. He had investigated me with the assumption that I was guilty, looking for proof of the crimes Lady Constance had invented. He had searched my lodgings, going through my possessions with the thoroughness of a man who expected to find damning evidence. He had questioned people from my past, former employers and acquaintances, seeking testimony that would support the narrative Lady Constance had constructed. He had prepared a case against me that, if presented, would have destroyed any chance I might have had to claim my inheritance. And then he had found the real evidence, the letters, the testament, the proof that everything Lady Constance had told him was lies. He had held those documents in his hands and realized that he had spent weeks working to destroy an innocent woman at the behest of a murderer. He told me that he had considered simply disappearing, abandoning the case and leaving London before I ever learned what he had almost done to me. But something had stopped him. Some remaining fragment of the man he had been before his disgrace, the man who had believed in justice and truth and protecting the innocent. He could not undo what he had nearly done, but he could try to make amends by bringing me the evidence that would save me instead. He told me that he had never expected me to trust him. He told me that his help was not given with any expectation of reward or gratitude. He told me that he understood if I wanted him out of my life, if the knowledge of what he had almost done made it impossible for me to look at him without anger. He told me, finally, that he had fallen in love with me somewhere along the way. In the late nights and shared meals and arguments about evidence, in watching me refuse to break no matter how much pressure was applied, in discovering that the woman he had been hired to destroy was the bravest and most remarkable person he had ever known. But he understood that his love meant nothing, could mean nothing, given the betrayal that had preceded it. He waited for my judgment with the posture of a man expecting a blow. I thought of all the betrayals I had survived, Gregory's systematic destruction of my confidence, Lady Constance's attempt to erase me from existence, the countless small cruelties of a society that valued appearance over truth and position over character. And I thought of what Adrian had actually done. Not what he had been hired to do, not what he had prepared to do, but what he had chosen when it mattered. He had looked at the evidence and seen the truth. He had abandoned his commission and risked Lady Constance's wrath. He had brought me the weapons I needed to fight, and he had stood beside me through every battle that followed. We are not defined by our worst impulses, I decided then. We are defined by what we do when we recognize them. I told Adrian that I was not angry. I told him that I understood the position Lady Constance had put him in, the lies she had told, the pressure she had applied. I told him that what mattered was the choice he had made when he learned the truth, and that his choice had been the right one. I told him, finally, that I had fallen in love with him too. The expression on his face when I said those words is something I have carried with me for the rest of my life. The surprise, the disbelief, the slow dawning of hope in eyes that had grown accustomed to expecting nothing good. He reached for my hand, and I gave it. And for a long moment we simply stood there, connected in the gray evening light. Two damaged people who had somehow found their way to each other through a labyrinth of conspiracy and pain. We did not marry immediately. There were practicalities to consider, estates to settle, a new life to build. And we both needed time, I think, to believe that what we had found was real, that it would not crumble at the first test. We courted in the old-fashioned way, with carefully chaperoned visits and letters written late at night, learning each other in the slow manner of people who intended to spend a lifetime together and saw no need to rush. We married in the autumn of 1890, in a small ceremony attended by a handful of true friends. I wore a gown of ivory silk, and Adrian wore a suit that made him look almost handsome, and when the vicar pronounced us husband and wife, I felt something settle into place inside me, a piece of a puzzle I had not known was incomplete. Our life together was not perfect. Whose is? We argued, sometimes fiercely, because we were both stubborn and opinionated and unused to compromise. We faced challenges, the ongoing legal complications of the Blackwood estate, the social ostracism from those who could not forgive us for disrupting their comfortable assumptions, the health troubles that plagued Adrian in his later years as a consequence of too many years of hard living. We had sorrows, children hoped for and lost, friends who died too young, the inevitable griefs that accumulate over a lifetime. But we also had joy, deep, sustaining joy that came from being truly known by another person and loved not despite our flaws, but encompassing them. Adrian understood me in ways no one else ever had. He challenged me when I needed challenging and supported me when I needed support. He made me laugh, even in dark times, with his dry wit and his unexpected tenderness. He was my partner in everything, my confidant, my best friend, my great love. I never learned the full truth about my father's death. Lady Constance died before she could be brought to trial, taking whatever secrets she still held to her grave. Lionel was convicted of conspiracy and fraud, but not murder, sentenced to transportation to Australia, from which he never returned. The exact circumstances of that night in 1874 remained shrouded in uncertainty, known only to those who had been there and who chose never to speak of it. But I made peace with that uncertainty. Some questions have no answers, and some truths are lost forever. What I knew was enough. My father had loved me, had tried to protect me even beyond death, had trusted that the truth would eventually find its way to light. I honored his memory by living the life he would have wanted for me, a life of purpose and love and meaning. I visit his grave sometimes, when the weather is fine and my joints permit the journey. The Blackwood family plot is in a quiet corner of a cemetery in Hampstead, near the church where I was baptized, and Samuel Blackwood's stone stands tall among his ancestors. I sit on a bench nearby and tell him about my life, about Adrian and our children and grandchildren, about the ways I have tried to use the fortune he left me to make the world a little better. I do not know if he can hear me. I do not know if the dead persist in any form that permits awareness of the living. But I speak to him anyway, because love is not diminished by uncertainty, and because saying the words aloud makes them feel true. Adrian died 5 years ago, quietly, in his sleep, after a brief illness that the doctors could not explain, and I did not try to fight. He was ready, I think. He had lived a good life, a redeemed life, and he was tired in ways that rest could no longer cure. I held his hand as he drifted away, and his last words to me were, "I love you, Eleanor," spoken in a whisper that I had to lean close to hear. I miss him every day. The house feels emptier without his presence, and I find myself turning to share observations with someone who is no longer there. But grief, I have learned, is the price we pay for love, and I would not trade a moment of our time together to avoid the pain of losing him. I am old now, as I said at the beginning of this account. My hair has gone white, my hands are spotted with age, and the face that looks back at me from the mirror bears little resemblance to the young woman who stood terrified in a courtroom 50 years ago. But inside, in the place where the essential self resides, I am still Eleanor, still stubborn, still curious, still capable of wonder at the strangeness and beauty of this world. They called me nothing in that courtroom. They laughed at my humiliation and dismissed my very existence. But I learned something in the years that followed, something that has stayed with me through all the changes and losses and unexpected joys. We are not what others call us. We are not the labels they attach to us or the stories they tell about us. We are what we choose to be, what we build through our actions and our commitments and our loves. I was nothing, according to the arbiters of society, but I made myself something. Not through wealth or status, but through the simple insistence on my own dignity. And when I finally revealed myself, when I stood in that courtroom and claimed my name and my inheritance, I was not proving them wrong about who I had been. I was showing them who I had always been, beneath the poverty and the obscurity and the carefully maintained invisibility. I was Samuel Blackwood's daughter. I was Catherine Wren's daughter. I was Adrian Hale's wife. I was Eleanor, my little star, loved before I knew myself, and carrying that love forward into generations yet to come. This is what I want you to understand, whoever you are, reading or hearing these words long after I am gone. The world will try to tell you who you are. It will offer you labels and limitations, categories and constraints. It will laugh at your aspirations and mock your dignity and insist that you are nothing more than the circumstances of your birth. Do not believe it. Do not accept the smallness others would impose upon you. You are more than they know. You carry within you the capacity for love and courage and transformation that no external force can diminish. I was mocked in that courtroom. I was called a fraud and a nothing and a woman of no consequence. But I knew the truth, even when I could not prove it. And in the end, the truth was enough. It always is.